In this movie, we will discuss some data conversion issues that you need to be aware of as you begin to write programs that involve calculations. Using our sample program, let's take a look at the code, and you'll notice that a few lines of code have been added. I've added a new variable called answer, which I have used as with a dim statement and have made this to be a type integer. The two statements that will parse the contents of the text boxes as an integer and store into the variables num1 and num2 respectively, that remains. But I've changed how the calculate statement is handled, and that I have now placed the result of that calculation into the variable called answer. Answer is the new variable I just created. And then finally, the answer is then being stored in our answer label. This allows us more flexibility when we want to create and display the results in a different format. Let's first run the program as is, and if I enter data such as 6 and 4, and it calculates the correct answer of 24. Returning to the code, notice that everything in this program is treated as integers. But what if our user were to enter data such as 7.2 and 6.1 and then click calculate? You'll notice that an error message pops up. This is a runtime error, and Visual Studio is now in the debugging mode. You notice that at the top of the screen, and it says make sure your method arguments are in the right format. Essentially, what this is telling us is that our parse statement of converting the contents of the text box and converting it from an integer into a variable is not correct, because it's recognizing that that's not the correct data type. The data that we entered was actually contained decimals. So if that's a real possibility in that the user could indeed enter decimal data, we would want to allow that to happen. So we would want to change our data types from integer to decimal. Now, notice that when you are making changes to your code, you must get out of the debugging mode and get back into the design mode. Since my num1 and num2 are going to be decimals, I'm going to make my answer a decimal as well. Now that means that I need to change my parse method from integer to decimal as well. Essentially, I'm now going to a wider data type. So now let's enter our data of 7.2 and 6.1 and calculate. As you can see, I'm now given an answer and the decimals are displayed. Notice that if we changed our answer variable from decimal to integer, then that will create another issue. And that is that if I run the program with that modification, with the same data used previously, you notice the answer is now a whole number, and it's actually automatically rounded, and the decimal places are truncated. You should be real careful when you are converting data from decimal to integer, unless you truly do want to lose the decimal points. As you can see, Visual Basic will allow that to happen. One way to avoid this is to use the option strict method. If I were to type in option strict on at the top of the code above the public class statement, you notice immediately I get error messages that tell me option strict on disallows implicit conversions from decimal to integer. That's really what we're doing here when we say num1 times num2, is that we are implicitly converting from decimal to integers. So option strict on is going to prevent us from doing that, and likewise is identifying that the answer is also going to be a piece of data that's been converted from integer to string. Integer to string because the contents of a text box is always treated as string data. So these are some of the issues you will start to come up with when you start creating calculations. The bottom line is that you should always be careful when you're converting and mixing data types. you'd want to make sure that if you do indeed want to convert from decimal to integer, that you will lose decimals, and that may or may not be allowed depending on whether you're using option strict on. One very easy way of turning option strict on off without taking it out of the code completely is simply to make it a comment. And by doing that, you notice immediately the error messages go away.